I started out, as a lot of students do, a lot of my students do, with an interest in production. As an undergraduate, I bought a movie camera and I fooled around with it and made a few films, and then decided that I wanted to do that in graduate school too. Went to graduate school in communications, and there fell in love with research and analysis and theory, and eventually actually have ended up teaching at the same place where I got my graduate degree. But that was the transition for me, from an interest in making films or working in visual media in general, to an interest in analyzing them, also making them. I still do take photographs, make movies, and so on. But I'm also very interested in how the medium works, which, by the way, let me add, for visual communication has always been the case, that people who are the best theorists also often, as you may know, very often happen to be people who've also made movies or are actually making movies actively at the same time that they're writing and analyzing. The best known example being Eisenstein, I think, the filmmaker Eisenstein, who was a great theorist, one of the founding fathers of communication, visual communication theory, and at the same time a major filmmaker. In broad terms, I would say it's an attempt to develop an understanding of how visual language works. Visual language is not a very good term because visual media or visual images don't really work the same way that verbal language does. But what I'm trying to do for visual images is the same kind of thing that linguists try to do for language, just to discover how it works. How do we respond to camera work, to editing? What are the variables that a producer works with in visual media, and how do viewers respond to those variables? That's been my goal. I've dealt with that question in a book on visual literacy, which I wrote a couple of years ago, and also dealt with it at greater length in a book that I've just finished, which should be coming out actually next week, a book on the uses of visual images in advertising. And that I'm really interested in, how visual images can create meanings in advertising that cannot be created through words. How visual images can persuade the viewer or involve the viewer in an ad or get across a certain meaning or a certain point that you couldn't really put into words. To give you an example, if you'd like me to continue with this, let me give you an interesting example that I actually saw on television. I was watching one of those tabloid news shows. I forget what it was. I think it was either Hard Copy or Current Affair. I don't remember which one. And for some reason, they were doing an analysis of bodybuilding pills that bodybuilders take to generate large muscles. And it turns out that these pills are totally useless. That they're no better than just eating a regular diet. And yet, people who are seriously involved in bodybuilding apparently take a lot of these pills per month, spend hundreds of dollars per month taking these pills. So as a part of this program, they did an analysis of the advertising for these pills. And in the ad, what you have is, on the one hand, the pills. On the page, you have the pills on the one hand and a very muscular bodybuilder on the other hand, establishing a visual connection between the two. The point being, if you take these pills, you will become like this. They took this ad to the manufacturer, and they said, well, how do you feel about this? Don't you feel, in light of the revelations that we've just come up with, that your pills are actually no better than just a regular diet? Don't you feel that this is misleading advertising? And he said, if you look at the copy, if you look at the verbal copy in the ad, you'll notice that nowhere do we say verbally that these pills have any special properties. And we can't be held liable for the interpretation that the viewer makes purely on the basis of the visuals. That's an example of the kind of thing that I'm interested in. The fact that you can get across a point visually and yet not be held accountable for it, because typically in our society, and in most societies, we scrutinize verbal messages very carefully, but we don't have a systematic understanding of the ideas that come across through the visuals, even though the idea is fairly simple. It's not as if it's a really complicated visual juxtaposition. It's a simple visual point, and yet the advertiser was correct. He's not accountable for the visual message in the same way that he is for the verbal message. That's the kind of analysis that I was interested in this book. An analysis of how visuals function to make points that we can't really make verbally, that would be embarrassing or illegal or in other ways not acceptable if we made them verbally. Another area that I was looking at was cigarette advertising, which does a lot of this. Although the Clinton administration has recently, as I'm sure you know, taken steps that might end this kind of practice. But for the moment, it's acceptable in a cigarette ad to have a picture of cigarettes on the one hand and a beautiful, pristine mountain landscape on the other hand, or you could have people playing sports or vigorous athletic activity, images of health, well-being, and so forth. And it's acceptable to have that juxtaposed with a pack of cigarettes in an ad. Lots of manufacturers do that. That's it seems to me, a fairly clear visual message that cigarettes are maybe, after all, not that unhealthy. You couldn't say that verbally. If you had a verbal message saying our cigarettes are not unhealthy, you would immediately run into trouble with the FTC or with the FDA for that matter. Visually, you can do it. Another example of the same kind of thing. I've also been looking at another kind of use of visuals in advertising, which is to use a visual image to prove a certain point that the ad wants to make because of people's faith in the connection between visual images and reality. When we look at a photograph, because a photograph is somewhat more automatically connected to reality than words are, we tend to trust a photograph more than an equivalent verbal statement. It's not that we're dumb or that we're naive about the nature of photography. There is indeed a more natural automatic connection between photography and real life. So when we see a picture in an ad or in any kind of setting in which the picture is reportedly or allegedly making some kind of point about reality, we tend to trust the picture, I think, a little bit more than we would trust a verbal statement. And that can be used in advertising to convince viewers of something that might not be that convincing if you said it verbally. For example, what's the ad? I forget, I think it's Whisk. There's an ad for Whisk in which you see someone, you see a man putting a very dirty handkerchief, or napkin, I think, in a bowl of whisk, and then he sort of whisks it around 2 or 3 times and then takes it out, and it's totally pristine, totally clean, in a matter of seconds. If I said that verbally, you might tend to doubt me. If you actually see it visually, you might tend to believe it a bit more. So that's another thing I'm interested in, and have also been looking at the various ways in which advertisers can actually abuse that kind of faith, the viewer's inclination to place faith in visuals. The alteration of images, digital alteration is something I'm very interested in, staging of images, things like that. Among the various areas of visual manipulation that people do get angry about, the manipulation of body image is one that I have found with my students too. Not only female, by the way, also male to some extent, because that's also done increasingly with male images. A lot of anger for the obvious reason that people often, a lot of people's ideal self-image comes from advertising, or even though you know to some extent, everyone knows that advertising images are constructed, but nonetheless, people would like to look like what you see in an attractive ad. And so they're angry if they feel that it's totally manipulated and totally unrealistic. If it's not just a matter, to begin with, most ads choose the most attractive people that they can find to put in the ad, and then if on top of that they also add muscles or change the skin tone or make people thinner, or one thing that they do is to make in still images, in single images, in Vogue or places like that. I don't know that Vogue specifically does it, but in fashion images they often make women's legs longer, as you may have seen. So those are among the other things that I've been looking at with this advertising book. And another aspect of this that I think is very interesting, on the general question of people comparing themselves with visual media and perhaps feeling that they don't measure up to the images that they see in visual media. One area of that what we were just talking about is physical appearance of people in visual media, and people, the consumers of visual media, feeling inadequate physically. But there's another very interesting aspect of this, which I've done some research on, and other people have done research on, which I would also like to mention, because it doesn't get discussed as much, but I think it's very important, is people feeling economic insecurity in comparison with what they see in visual media. Let me describe, if I have the time, a specific study that I did about this issue many years ago. I was doing interviews with mothers of elementary school children in Philadelphia. And I had a very broad cross-section socioeconomically, ranging from very wealthy people to very poor people. And in all cases, what I was interested in was discussions between parents and children about the kinds of things that they see on television. What kinds of questions do children ask their mothers about things that they see on TV, and what do mothers feel they have to tell children to help them understand television better, or not to, if they're frightened by something that they see, or if they develop other kinds of inappropriate responses, what do mothers feel they have to tell their children to help them get a better understanding of the medium? One of the things that came up repeatedly, especially with poor mothers, was children complaining to their mothers about their own family circumstances, their own socioeconomic circumstances, compared to what they were seeing on television. If they were seeing a sitcom, for example, in an especially luxurious environment, children were often very bitter. They were bitter about being poor, about not having the kind of beautiful house and clothes and so on that they saw on TV. And this came up a lot. I was amazed. I hadn't expected this. This isn't something that I built into the study. It's something that came up spontaneously. And repeatedly mothers said to me that I have to explain to them, this is not the real world. Not everyone has the beautiful houses that you see on television. Don't feel that bad. Our next door neighbor doesn't live any better than we do. That seems to be a pervasive theme, and I think it's not just confined to children. I think that older people, although they might not think about it as much, may retain a sense of having been, of an injustice having been done to them if their own economic circumstances aren't as wealthy or as comfortable as what they are routinely exposed to in visual media. Not just advertising, but fiction too. I think I can divide the people working in visual communication into two groups. One group is people like Bob Tiemens, Metalinas, who else? Herb Zettel, very prominent among that group. People who are primarily concerned with the formal aspects of visual media, with formal analysis. They want to know how do people respond to a close-up? How do people respond to a low camera angle? How do people respond to fast editing or slow editing or whatever? Then there's a different group, Paul Lester being very prominent among that latter group, who are not that concerned with these analytical, formally oriented questions, and more concerned with the broad social functions of visual media. Especially in Paul Lester's case, how visual media mediate the perception of various social groups towards each other. He's just published a very important book on images that injure, how images of African Americans or various other demographic groups might hurt the self-esteem or hurt the perception or damage the perception of African Americans or other people by other members of their society. That's a different kind of question, very different kind of question, not that concerned with the formal characteristics of the medium. What I am trying to do myself, having started with the former type of research, the formally oriented research, but now moving away from it, is to try to integrate the two. What I'm working on now, my next book, which I will begin to write next week actually, as soon as the second one comes out, I'll start working on the third one, deals with violence in the media and is an attempt to talk about social consequences of violence in the media, but with some attention to the way violence is handled formally. Okay, so the question then is, how does a formally oriented analysis or formal approach, how can it inform or how can it contribute to a concern with broader social issues? In the area of violence, I would say the following. I mentioned violence because that's what I'm working on myself right now. And so I have been thinking about that connection for my own work on violent imagery in visual media. Increasingly, I think people who deal with violence in the media are arguing that we need to go beyond a global sense of what violence is or what violence means. In other words, if we're doing content analysis, for example, don't just count the violent acts. Count or try to deal with the specific nature of violence, the specific context in which violence is presented, and how exactly it's presented. The assumption being that violence can mean very, very different things depending on whether it's presented in one way or another. That's where formal analysis comes in, because part of the presentation is the formal aspect of the presentation. Does violence tend to focus, does the presentation of a violent act tend to focus on the person committing the violence or the person suffering the violence? If there are subjective camera placements in the scene, does the subjective camera give you the point of view of the violent person or the person suffering the violence? For example, a persistent criticism of slasher movies has been that slasher movies tend to give the slasher's point of view. In other words, giving you the perspective, the point of view of someone who is committing violence, very often against a woman. Presumably our concern about these movies would be very different if what we got were the victim's point of view. So we would be to encourage to identify with the victim. That's an example in which formal analysis, it seems to me, is very important to an understanding of social consequences. Another area in which this kind of question has come up, we just had a panel at this conference 2 days ago on the films of Quentin Tarantino, in which the formal presentation of violence is very important, because one of the complaints that people have had against Tarantino's films is that it tends to make violence very casual. It doesn't give you the build-up, the formal build-up that violence gets in other movies. In a lot of other violent movies, the music, the visual presentation of the violence make it a big deal. In Tarantino's films, it tends to be done very casually. The camera work doesn't emphasize it. You won't get a close-up of the violence. The music won't even seem to be violently oriented music. The camera won't really dwell that much on the act of violence. And you could argue it both ways, whether that's what the consequences of that kind of presentation of violence might be. To me, actually, it seems in some ways even more shocking because it makes it appear so casual and matter-of-fact. But other people have argued the opposite, that we need to make violence seem to be a big deal, that it shouldn't be treated that casually and haphazardly. But that's another example. Do I have any critics? Not of the work that I'm doing right now, because the book that I've just written on advertising and my current work on violence doesn't take any positions that I think are particularly controversial. But I did have critics of my first book on visual literacy, because I was taking the position that there's considerable continuity between real-world vision and pictorial vision, pictorial interpretation. In other words, that we apply our real-world perceptual skills to the interpretation of pictures. I was saying that, which I think is true, and I think there's a lot of research which confirms that that's true. I was saying that because it seems to me that it's important to realize that connection in order to be aware of the extent to which we can be fooled by visual media into ignoring the constructed nature of visual media. But unfortunately, some of my readers have thought that what I was saying was that visual media are indeed not constructed, which is the exact opposite of what I'm saying. My argument is that they are constructed, but they're constructed in such a way as to fool your eye into thinking it's a natural event. So I don't really see any contradiction between what I have to say and what I think other people believe, and therefore I don't think it's a big issue. Okay, what are my methodological assumptions? That's a very good question. If you had asked me this question 5 or 10 years ago, I would have had a very clear statement, because at the time I was doing very straightforward experimental and survey types of research. I have found that as, maybe it's just a matter of growing older, and as I grow older, wanting to deal with larger questions, I have found that when you're trying to deal with larger questions, you have to allow some sloppiness into your method. You can't expect to be able to have the certainty that you would have if you were dealing with narrower questions and therefore able to have a very tight method. So now I'm moving somewhat further away from strict quantitative and very systematic research of the kind that I used to do, and more towards descriptive and historical and heavily interpretive research. In the research that I'm doing now, in the book that I'm about to write on violence, I'm not going to be able to answer questions with the kind of certainty that I had 5 or 10 years ago when I was doing a small experiment on a very narrow aspect of how people respond to one particular variable. Now I'm just going to have to say, I think, or my interpretation is, or this is what seems reasonable to me, and I hope it seems reasonable to the reader too.